What's good, guys? Today I'm going to explain to you how to survive the sinking of the Titanic.
She split.
So buckle in, I'm going to take you all the way back to 1912 and we're going on the Titanic. What is up, Titanic nerds? It's Raph the Titanic guy Avila, and here on my channel we talk about the Titanic, disasters, and other historical events. So if you're weirdly obsessed with disasters, consider subscribing and joining our community of Titanic nerds. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about a question that is one of my most asked questions on my TikTok lives, and that is, Raph, if you were to go back in time and you were on the Titanic, how would you survive? And I get this question all the time and I answer it all the time. So I figured, okay, let's make a video about it. And let's outline all the possible ways that we could survive if we went back to the Titanic. Okay, so this is gonna be a really fun hypothetical, but I think we need to make some assumptions before we start. So number one, let's assume that it's me as I am today and I'm going back in time. So I'm a grown adult man on the Titanic. I'm not a child, I'm not a woman, I'm just me. Number two, I am a passenger, just a normal passenger, not a crew member, not an officer, just a passenger. Three, I went back in time and I arrived right when the Titanic hit the iceberg, so at 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, 1912, and that is when the time starts ticking down. And number four, we're gonna assume that I have hindsight, which means that I go back in time with the knowledge that I have today. So that means I know the order of the lifeboats, I know the ship, I know that the ship is going to sink. Okay, so we have those assumptions. I'm a grown adult man, I'm a passenger, I went back right when Titanic hit the iceberg, and I understand the Titanic is going to sink. Okay, let's do this. Let's go back in time. Let's pretend that we're in a time machine and we are now transported back to the Titanic. Cool transition. Okay, so the way that I always like to answer this is there are really several scenarios in which you could survive. So a lot of it really depends on which class you were in. First and second class gentlemen, they had a much higher chance of surviving compared to a third class man. So I'm gonna outline a couple of survival scenarios, assuming that I'm a first or second class man. So survival scenario number one, the first thing that I would do, guys, is as soon as I found out about the iceberg, I would go straight up to the boat deck, immediately go straight to the boat deck, go to the starboard side of the ship, that's the right side of the ship, and toward the front of the ship. Now, the reason I would do this is because First Officer William Murdoch, he was the officer in charge of loading those starboard side lifeboats. And history teaches us that First Officer Murdoch, he was a little bit more lenient with that women and children first rule, right? His rule was women and children first, while on the port side, Second Officer Lightoller was a lot more strict. He said women and children only. We know that a lot of prominent men survived because First Officer Murdoch let them into the lifeboat. For example, Sir Cosmo and Lady Duff Gordon. Sir Cosmo survived on lifeboat number one, which only had 12 people in it, right? If there were no other women or children around, his priority was to get as many passengers off the ship evacuated, and that included men. So my first scenario would be to go to those early lifeboats with First Officer Murdoch, assuming that he would let me on the lifeboat being a man. This would probably be the highest likelihood of survival. This is my preferred scenario because think about it. Early on in the evacuation, passengers didn't want to get off the ship. So First Officer Murdoch really was trying to get as many people off because he needed to get those forward lifeboats out and away because the ship was sinking bow down, right? So he needed to clear those first couple of lifeboats before he could start loading the ones at the back. So if I were there, I would be standing right in front of lifeboat number 7, which was the first lifeboat to be launched. So to summarize, my first choice would be to run straight up to the boat deck, toward the front of the ship on the starboard side, and get into one of those early lifeboats that was being run by First Officer Murdoch. Water break. Okay, scenario number 2. Let's say that you missed those early lifeboats. Say that I somehow got held up, and those early lifeboats are now gone. The next option that I would choose is I would still stay toward the front of the ship on the starboard side, and I would try to get off on Collapsible C. Now, this is a lifeboat that Bruce Ismay famously, or infamously really, embarked on. He evacuated on Collapsible C. And the reason why he was able to do that is because Collapsible C was one of the only lifeboats there at the front of the ship. Bruce Ismay was helping to load that lifeboat. Oh, and by the way, Bruce Ismay was the chairman of the White Star Line. So he basically more or less owned the Titanic. Right when they were about to lower the lifeboat, it wasn't super full. He saw there were no other women and children, so he got on. And we know that other men were rescued on Collapsible C. So me being a man, if I had gone up to the boat deck too late and I missed those first lifeboats, like lifeboat number 7, 5, 3, 1, I would be hanging around Collapsible C and waiting my chance, because we know that First Officer Murdoch probably would have let me go into that lifeboat. Okay, so now before I move on to the next scenario, there's actually another scenario that I just remembered that could probably save your life. It's not a very honorable scenario. I'll talk about that later on, so stay tuned. But anyway, I'll talk about that in a bit. The next scenario, I am now gonna assume that I'm a third class passenger. Okay, and the first two options that I talked about, I was a first or second class passenger, so it was easier for me to get up to the boat deck. Now I'm pretending that I got transported back in time to a third class area. I'm a third class passenger. What would I do being a third class passenger? We know that on the real Titanic, a lot of third class passengers, they didn't get out into the boat deck until later on in the night for several reasons. You know, people have said that they were held back by gates and stuff. There's no real evidence of this. But it most likely is that a lot of them were very confused. They were in the third class areas of the ship at the very bottom, either at the bow or at the stern. For me, being a third class gentleman, I would be at the bow. So I'd have to find my way from the bottom of the ship, which was already flooding, trying to get up. So let's assume that by the time I made my way through the labyrinth that was the decks of the Titanic, the majority of the lifeboats are gone. What would I do? So in this scenario number 3, all the lifeboats are gone. I would probably still wait near the bridge toward the front of the ship, and I would be waiting in front of Collapsible B. The reason why I would do this is because we know that after the final lifeboat was launched, which was Collapsible D, there were still 2 lifeboats, Collapsible A and Collapsible B, that were stored on top of the officers' quarters. I don't know why I'm doing this with my hands. They were stored on top of the officers' quarters, right? And Collapsible B actually ended up being flipped over and landing upside down on the deck. Now, we know that on the real Titanic, those 2 lifeboats, they were never officially launched because they ran out of time. The water started coming over the decks, and both of those lifeboats just floated off of the ship. Now, Collapsible B is the one that I would stand in front of because we know that many, many men were saved by climbing on top of that overturned lifeboat. Notably, Second Officer Lightoller survived on Collapsible B, Colonel Archibald Gracie, Jack Thayer, the wireless operator Harold Bride, and the now famous drunk baker Charles Jugan. They all survived by clinging onto this overturned boat. So if I had arrived up to the deck way too late, there were no lifeboats left, I would probably choose to stand right in front of Collapsible B, and as soon as it got washed off, I would climb on top of that, and I would hope that I would be able to survive like so many other men did. Okay, now we've gotten to scenario number 4. This is a scenario that I'm a third class passenger. Every single lifeboat is gone. I am not at the front of the ship. Both of those collapsibles, Collapsible A and Collapsible B, they've been washed off, and now I'm just on deck and the stern is slowly rising. What would I do in that scenario? If I got caught in that scenario, I would do exactly what Jack and Rose did in the movie. I would move straight to the stern of the ship and try to stay on the Titanic as long as possible. We know that the majority of people that night, they didn't die from drowning. They died from hypothermia, from being exposed to that freezing water, right? And a lot of people didn't last very long. You probably would have been able to last maybe 10 minutes, max 15 minutes. I'm a little wimp when it comes to the cold, so I would have been dead in 5 minutes. So I would have gone straight to the stern of the ship, and I would have tried to ride it down like an elevator, like the drunk baker did, Charles Jugan. He rode that all the way down. So I would have tried to stay on the ship as long as possible, try to avoid getting wet. And then once I'm in the water, I would look for some sort of elevated surface. The key to surviving in the water would be to keep your body outside of that water. If you were submerged in the water, like Jack was hanging on to that wooden board with Rose, he died because he was underneath the water. His body was in the water. However, there is a real case of a survivor that actually was picked up from the water. His name was Fang Lang. He was one of the famous Chinese survivors. There's actually a new documentary coming out about him called The Six. And he was featured in a deleted scene in Titanic, in James Cameron's Titanic. And he survived by standing on top of a door, right? And the reason he survived is because his body was out of the water, right? So that made a big difference. So if I was caught in that scenario, what I would do is I would go to the back, stay on the ship as long as possible. And when I'm in the water, I really have 5 minutes to find a piece of wreckage that would allow me to stay above the water, that would hold my weight. But again, if I'm in that scenario, things are very, very tough. I'd really be hoping to get on those early lifeboats, as I mentioned in scenario number 1. And there you go, guys. That's pretty much all the scenarios. Unfortunately, really, your best chances of survival are getting onto those early lifeboats. And since I have hindsight going back in time in this scenario, I'd just be waiting there patiently, having a brandy, waiting until the lifeboats are uncovered. Lifeboat number 7 is being loaded, and I would just boop, hop in there, no problem. In fact, I probably would have been seen as a hero for, stepping up and encouraging other people to go into those rickety lifeboats. So. Now, earlier in the video, I said that there is one final scenario, which I think is another way that you could have survived. I personally would never do this, but we know that people did this. Now, that scenario is, as a man, you could dress up as a woman and get into one of the lifeboats. We do know that there were cases of this. 5th Officer Lowe, who was the one who went back to look for survivors, when he was transferring survivors from one lifeboat to another, he actually came across a man who was dressed as a woman. He pulled off a shawl, and it turns out that it was a man, right? And he testified later, and he said that he was disgusted with this. There's a man trying to dress up as a woman, as a coward, to save his own life. So in a final, last-ditch effort, if you really wanted to, that is an option. I would never personally do that, but that's just me. Maybe you guys would. Maybe you'd find another way of surviving. If you can think of another scenario of surviving, let me know in the comments. I'm interested to see what you guys say. So there you have it, ladies and gents. That is how to survive the Titanic. Anyway, guys, that's all for today's video. If you guys are jealous of my super awesome Titanic mug, it's available on my merch store, titanicguy.com. You can get your very own. If you guys liked the video, please don't forget to leave it a like and to subscribe to the channel and join our community of Titanic nerds. And don't forget to leave me a comment and let me know how you would survive the Titanic. And just for subscribing, I have a little something extra for you, as always. So I mentioned to you that there was a real passenger that did dress up as a woman. And in the movie Titanic, there's a very, very short deleted scene, a deleted snippet, where we can see 5th Officer Lowe finding that man who dressed up as a woman. So here you go.
Not too quickly, madam. How dare you get in there, will you?
Okay, that's all for this week. Bye.